Thank you all for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 2 meeting related to the transmission commitment and congestion revenue allocation. I'm here today with my colleagues, Debbie Levine, who is the facilitator assigned to this working group, and Emily Hughes, who is our scribe. We're also joined by Philip Hennigill as well, who is the coordinator overseeing all three of our active EDAM working groups. And I'd also like to thank Kathy Anderson as well, who is here today to present on behalf of the EIM entities transmission elements of the EDAM design, as you can see. The meetings for this specific working group are held weekly, on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific, the participation details of which are available on the ISO's public calendar. And on the next slide, for today's agenda, you can see today's discussion will start off with a comparison of the Western Open Access Transmission Service Tariff versus the ISO transmission, followed by sources of the EDAM transmission capacity. Also, as a courtesy reminder, these working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we, of course, encourage participants to share ideas and perspectives during these meetings. And if at any time you have any questions, please raise your hand by using the virtual raise hand icon, unless you happen to dial in separately by phone, in which case you would need to dial #2, and the facilitator will be sure to call on you. And we please request, of course, that you state your name and your affiliation first so that the rest of the working group knows who's speaking. And as you may know as well, these working group meetings are recorded and the video files are posted on the corresponding working group web pages. And we please request that you ask permission from the ISO before printing these transcriptions. And as you may also know, stakeholders are welcome to present their perspectives at these meetings. And so please submit any request to present using the link located on the resources slide at the end of this deck. The materials related to the Working Group 2 meetings are posted on the associated webpage, which is also linked on the resources slide, along with other links to help you engage in the EDAM stakeholder process. And with that, I'll turn it over to Debbie.
Deb, remember to unmute your line. One moment, I'll do that for you. Deb, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Jimmy. Welcome, everyone, to the second week of the working group session on transmission commitment and congestion rents. As we discussed on Thursday of last week, we're going to be going in today to a discussion on the buckets and the EDAM transmission capacity, and Kathy Anderson has graciously offered to go ahead and run through a presentation. On the side, I'll go ahead and continue to take the notes that I was taking on the scoping document that we've been working off of so that we've got the notes. And I'm sure all of you have seen, if you've looked, we have been posting those notes after the meetings. So if you want to know what the discussions are, then you can get it from there. The other thing that I'm working on with the team is to try and give everyone an idea of when we're going to talk about the different topics. We've got transmission availability, transmission unavailability, congestion, congestion rents, and a few other items. So the schedule is going to be an estimated schedule because we don't know how long it's going to take to talk about each subject and either come to a conclusion or come to a point where we understand the various options that are available. But that way it will give individuals an opportunity to have a better idea as to when the different subject matters are likely to get discussed. And I'll, of course, update that schedule if we've already completed one of the topics that we're in the process of discussing. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kathy Anderson. Kathy, thanks so much for the presentation, and the floor is all yours.
All right, thanks. So hopefully you can hear me. Okay.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I will note to all my EIM entity friends out there, and even others, that this actually is a presentation that was put together and given back in, I think, 2020, when this whole stakeholders process of EDAM kicked off. And we were all in person at CAISO at one time, and there was a panel of people that presented on transmission concepts that the EIM entities had been thinking about. So this is not kind of new material. This is just material that is just basically slides that are pulled from that presentation. So it shouldn't be new to any of the EIM folks, and it might not be new to anybody that also was at that first in-person meeting back before COVID. So just to kind of get that out of the way so nobody in the EIM community thinks I'm going rogue and on my own here. So if you want to go to the next slide, when we started thinking about EDAM and transmission, not sure what the next slide is. Off the agenda, I still see the agenda. Maybe it's just me. Okay, go one more. One of the key things with EDAM is that we all are still keeping our own oats. We're still the transmission provider. We still have to provide service under our oats in some manner. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to change in some way to accommodate EDAM. Many of us think that we probably will have to make some changes, just like what we had to do in EIM. But it really is, what is that has to be done? So one of the things that we've got is, FERC Order 888 did require all public utilities that own and operate and control transmission facilities to offer transmission service and ancillary services, take that service for their own use under the same terms and conditions as under their OAT. Then there was the functional separation. You can kind of see all of that stuff on the left there. But the key is, we all have a FERC filed OAT, at least if we are FERC jurisdictional, and we adhere to that. And you can see on the right that the process that the tariff defines for the pro forma services. So I think the big key takeaway here is, yes, there are rules that have come out from FERC, and we all have to adhere to those rules. And any changes that we want to make to that, we've got to file at FERC and get those approved as well. Okay, next slide. In the OAT, there's different types of services, and then there's different terminology. The first one of the main ones is network integration transmission service, and you'll hear it called NITS. It is that firm transmission that's utilized by a load serving entity or customer, basically, and they have that firm service is available provided that they have a designated network resource attached to it. So a network customer cannot use more transmission than they have load, but that doesn't mean they can't have more designated resources than they have load. It's just that at any time the transmission can't exceed their load needs. That's kind of the general rule. Then the OAT also allows for secondary network, which is a non-firm usage of the system that doesn't require a designated network resource. And it's on a priority of non-firm, but is the highest of non-firm. So it can bump some point-to-point transmission that is also non-firm. The other type of transmission service in the OAT is point-to-point. And point-to-point is, just like it states, it's a specific point of receipt into the transmission service provider system, and then it's delivered to a specific point on their system. So it's very very specific in what path it's using, what transmission it's using. It varies in length of service depending on the transmission service provider. There's long-term and short-term. It also has different firmness. There's firm and non-firm. And the transmission in this case is charged based on the reserve capacity. So if you reserve 100 megawatts, you're charged for 100 megawatts, as opposed to NIT service, which is generally charged on a load ratio share. Under both types of service, there is available transfer capability, or ATC. And it's basically the transfer capability that remains on the system after all other obligations are accounted for. And the methodologies that each provider uses to calculate ATC is found in their OATs, and generally more detail in their business practices. So when we start talking EDAM and we start talking the various buckets, ATC becomes potentially a bucket where a transmission provider might be able to provide some excess transmission. But these are just some level setting things, and I think most people on this call are probably very familiar with this OAT service. And again, this is the same slide deck we went over in 2020, but just kind of a refresher. Next slide. This slide deck, again, just does a very, very high level comparison of the OAT to the CAISO tariff. And again, this slide deck was put together in 2020, so if there have been any changes to the CAISO tariff since then, we didn't update this. So anything that they've done with regards to their other efforts isn't here. But in general, they are a little bit different in how they operate, due to one being an ISO and the others kind of not. But this is just trying to show that comparison. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide because I'm not a big expert on this one. Next slide. Again, some more areas where we just kind of compared and contrasted: congestion management, how losses are dealt, what the curtailment priority tends to look like, and also kind of what is wheeling looking like. And this slide, I think this presentation is posted out on the website, so people can get a more detailed look at it. It's probably posted in the 2020 meeting also. Next slide.
Yeah. Kathy, it is posted for everyone.
Okay, perfect. Not only do we have just a difference between the ISO and a general, pro forma tariff, we also have some diversity in regulatory entities. So, for instance, an investor-owned utility will provide transmission service under a FERC-approved OAT. All their rates and OAT changes have to be approved by FERC in publicly notified dockets. But non-interstate business is regulated by a state regulatory business or body. So that's kind of the investor-owned model. That would be like Idaho Power's model. You also have municipalities and public utility districts, and those are, various structures depending on who they are. Some of them are very limited, if any, FERC regulatory regulations or FERC-approved OATs. They are regulated by their local governance usually, and whatever regulatory scheme that would be. So they have a very different structure, but yet, we have those folks in the EIM as EIM entities as well. We also have power marketing administrations, and again, they're different. They have oversight usually by DOE and Congress. They are limited usually in their FERC regulation. Like Bonneville Power, for instance, does have an OAT, but it's not necessarily a FERC-approved OAT. I believe it's by the administration, but my friends at Bonneville can speak to that if there's questions related to their OAT. And then you have the provincial utilities who, again, are limited in their FERC regulation. And in this case, this would be, the marketing organization is the EIM entity. This one's kind of like the PowerX. So we have various different entities within the EIM entity community also with regards to transmission service. And so it's not so much a one-size-fit-all you know, absolutely FERC pro forma, because again, each of these transmission service providers have different regulatory environments that they have to work under. So that's something to keep in mind as everyone's working through this, that, you know, yes, many of us have to go to FERC and get approval to change our OATs. We have our own stakeholder processes, but there are entities that are not FERC jurisdictional that maybe have differences in their OAT because that's what works for their system, and that needs to be potentially considered as well. Okay, next slide. So when the EIM community started thinking about this a few years ago now, 3, 4, I don't know, 2, however long, we've started talking about EDAM, we started thinking about where does the transmission that makes EDAM happen come from. In EIM, it is basically either donated firm transmission from a customer of yours, or it is what we call ATC, or basically that's really scheduling availability. So anything that's not scheduled on an intertie gets provided to the market. So it's going to be one of those two places. That provides, especially when you talk about unscheduled transmission, quite a bit of potential transmission that goes into the market depending on the interface. Because again, if it's unscheduled, even if it's purchased but unscheduled, it can be utilized. So we started thinking about, okay, that seems to be okay when you're talking intra-hour, known very, you know, close to the horizon of being used time frame. But what does it look like when you have to back this up into a day ahead to where transmission sales are still being done, bilateral deals are still being done, transmission usage by a customer could still be done? What does that look like, and where does that transmission come from? So next slide. So we started with, you know, kind of some key objectives, and that was that we wanted to enable the maximum transmission available through a voluntary design framework. We're trying to avoid material cost shifts, so, you know, we don't want big winners and big losers. We don't want winners and losers at all if we can avoid it, but that is likely not potentially avoided or able to be avoided. So we also want to respect OAT right holders. Remember, those OAT right holders are paying for that usage, and they own those rights. We want it to be compatible with the transmission service provider's OATs and practices, and we wanted to ensure the appropriate transmission compensation framework, which basically we're looking to ensure that transmission service providers get sufficient revenue recovery and that they're consistent with the FERC open access policies. Now, recognizing that they may not fit the letter of the orders and the laws and all of that, but if there's a way that meets the intent, that we can be a little bit more out of the box and go to FERC about, we were open to that. The key principle, transmission supporting EDAM must be reliable and high quality. When we first started talking about this, the high quality was really a big question to me. What does that even mean? And I think the big overall reaching, at least from my perspective, is that if this transmission is in the market and it is optimized and used by the market, it needs to not be something that can disappear for a non-reliability reason just because someone decides they want to use it in a different way. Because now all of a sudden you deal with a market solution that has changed, you deal with financial implications of that, and you could put another entity in it that is relying on this market transfer because they've decommitted some other resource in a reliability issue. And the last thing we want to do is create that situation where we start creating an unstable operating environment for load because the transmission that's in the system being used by the market is not reliable. So the transmission, that we talked about, well, you could just restrict it to firm. Although there could be potential firm and conditional firm. I mean, so firm in that manner. There could be potential for other uses for capacity that's usually only sold non-firm. So for instance, if an entity has a capacity benefit margin on their system, or a transmission reliability margin on their system, or there's some seasonal unused network capacity that could be used, could that be identified by the customer or the transmission provider, and identified mostly by the transmission provider in the case of these three things, but could that be identified by the transmission provider and let the market utilize it? So those are some questions that we came out with high quality. Is we didn't want to exclude this by flat out saying firm, because there is this potential that this could exist. Next slide. So that led us to the concept of the buckets. And again, the buckets are not, there's nothing grand and special about the term bucket. It was just a way for us to think about, where does this transmission come from? Who's donating it? What are the conditions in which it is being offered to the market? And is there incremental compensation that's needed in some way, or how is it compensated? And so that's really why these buckets kind of came. And so when we were talking about it as kind of an EIM group, we got to thinking about, okay, so the first one that's kind of obvious to us as far as transmission, we all use transmission to serve our load. We've all procured that transmission on our system or other systems, if it happens to be an off-system resource, in order to serve our load. And so those are the resources and the transmission that we're going to say, okay, market, this is my plan to serve my load. This is how I'm showing you I'm resource sufficient. And the thought was that that transmission, provided it doesn't have some kind of must take obligations or some other contractual arrangement that requires it to not be optimized, should be able to be optimized by the market. And by that I mean, for instance, Idaho Power has some contractual obligations that do not allow us to redispatch certain resources on any kind of economic basis. They are completely must-take resources. And so any transmission that's allocated for those can't be used by the market, because it's really can only be used by that resource, provided that resource is operating. So there is going to be some of this bucket transmission that is not like absolutely in there, but the thought is there should be a lot of it that is available. That's the bucket one. Bucket two kind of goes to what exists today, and what we're calling the interchange rights holder is that a transmission customer who has procured point-to-point transmission under the OAT of the transmission service provider could voluntarily offer that into the market. And then it was the bucket three, which is that remaining ATC, or that unsold capacity, which is a little bit different than EIM, which is unscheduled. This is truly unsold capacity that might be remaining on the transmission provider system that could be utilized by the market. So when we talked about different types of transmission to put in the market, again, with the concept of trying to maximize the amount that goes in, that's where the buckets really came from. And it was, again, who is providing it, where's it coming from, and then it led to conversations about potential compensations. I just want to pause. Dave, Kevin, anything to add at this point in time?
Nothing here, Kathy. That was great.
No, Kathy, thank you.
Okay, so again, don't get hung up on the word buckets. It really was just our way to identify kind of where this stuff's coming from. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So then in the presentations that we gave back before COVID, we started talking a little bit about what these buckets looked like. And just as a reminder, this again was that slide. This is, bucket one is that transmission that's acquired in advance of any kind of market run or offering into the market, and it's purchased at OAT rates. And this is, again, usually done to meet the resource sufficiency. It's really usually done to meet potential RA programs. For instance, Idaho Power may go and purchase, if we are short, make long-term energy purchases and the transmission to go with it in order to serve load, because maybe we are not sufficient within our own balancing authority. So this is that transmission. Again, it can be resources external to the VA, but are owned or contracted to serve the load in the VA. So for Idaho Power, we have a couple generators that are outside of our balancing authority that we actually do import into our balancing authority, and it could be that transmission. It could be bilateral firm energy contracts, so the transmission associated with those, and it could be bilateral bid range or capacity transactions and the transmission that goes with those. So these are just some examples, not all. It's not all inclusive. But the key concept for this is that generally this is owned by a load-serving entity. The transmission is already paid for by that load-serving entity, and you're allowing the market to re-optimize that transmission, and so therefore it shouldn't require an incremental transmission rate, because the transmission service provider who you obtained that from is already being compensated. So really the question comes down to is there additional compensation to the customer or the load-serving entity? And it was kind of felt like, well, they should be able just to get their fair allocation of congestion rents. There shouldn't be an additional hurdle rate attached to this beyond that. And they should get that for voluntarily providing this optimizable transmission. So that's the bucket one. Okay, next slide.
So Cal, before you go on, oh, you're still going on bucket one. Keep going.
Okay. So optimizing resource sufficiency transmission, there's the concept of what do you do with third-party customer treatment. And again, transmission that's needed for third-party out customers' resource sufficiency should be included as a market input, but do not necessarily get optimized in EDAM. And they could be treated as a non-optimized self-schedule. So, there are entities that are not going to be the utility that is joining EDAM, just like there's entities that are in EIM that don't necessarily participate from a resource participation perspective in EIM. So the thought is you just can't optimize all their transmission and leave these third-party customers that are sitting in your balancing authority hanging. So these are some of the concepts that we had around there. We want to, minimize the potential congestion rents, but, it's important that we have the accommodation of these schedules, but that they not cause uplifts to other customers. And then, just all these points. So let's go to the next slide, see if it's still about bucket one. If it's not, we'll take some questions. Can't remember. Next slide.
Yeah. Next slide goes on to bucket three.
Oh, okay.
So,
bucket two. Okay, then we can just go back. Sorry. Yep. So I don't know if you want to, stop and we can take some questions on that to this point.
Yeah, Kathy, let's go ahead and take some questions. We do have George Angelides has a question.
Okay. Hey, George.
Oh, hi, Kathy. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Just a comment on the previous slide on bucket one regarding whether bucket one transmission is optimizable in EDAM and the concept of the self-schedule. So we have self-schedules at the resource level. It's like a form of a bid, but there is no mechanism that we have today to associate a particular resource schedule with a transfer. The transfer is more of a generic BA to BA energy or capacity exchange. And although you can picture a self-schedule in excess of meeting your local BAA demand being transferred over transfer mechanism over it could be bucket one. It's hard to say that this is not optimized in EDAM because once you have it available and in the market will try to make the most efficient use of it. It's really difficult to say that it's not optimized. I think once it becomes available in EDAM, it will be optimized. It will be used in the most efficient way, and it's a general notion that both bids and self-schedules are optimized over the entire market footprint. So you could make a loose association saying that this resource self-schedule is using this bucket one transmission to go to another BAA, but there's really no mechanism to actually tie those down because the optimization is over the entire market footprint, over all the resources. So I think it's safer to say that all the transmission that is made available to the market is optimized. We don't have the concept of a self-schedule just for transmission. It's at the resource level. That's what I wanted to bring up here for clarity, maybe. Thank you.
Any other questions at this time? Yeah, Kathleen?
Yeah, great, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. First, I wanted to say thanks, Kathy, for doing this and going over this presentation again. I think it's really helpful. One thing that I thought was worth maybe level setting on my side is it occurred to me as, I've talked with folks and listening to this presentation that most of the things that I think I'm raising in these working groups may be more implementation. I mean, not implementation, but might be the next level of detail that I think your group didn't get to. Because I think I've jumped to how do we do these things. But I just want to see, Kathy, if you could kind of respond to that. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have not given great thought into, in fact, probably not a whole lot of thought into how we do these, right? What is the mechanics? How is it going to work? These are still just kind of the concepts that we were thinking of with regards to, okay, we have these obligations to these customers. How do we not impact them, but yet how do we get the most transmission? So you are completely 100% right. The how and the details of that are not fleshed out, at least in, from the EIM entity stuff that we presented in 2020.
Okay, no, that's super helpful. And I think it's a great place, kind of just I wanted to float that just for the broader community. I did not just have that aha moment. And partially because what George just said, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about the how, and I actually do think this is doable. And I think that where the confusion, I think, George, you heard was do something different with transmission and don't optimize the transmission all in the market. And I think that, and the way that I've been thinking about it is, yes, of course, and I understand that this requires being creative, but I think it's doable. That part of our proposal for respecting these forward transmission rights, which we are also making the transmission market group process, is that there be a pre-day ahead market, so a day ahead scheduling requirement, submit the e-tags associated with the resource that has those longer term rights. The market would then prioritize any self-scheduled submitted as intertie transactions at these new intertie points that we're also suggesting needs to be a part of the design. And it's just as you said, the self-schedules can be submitted at the resource level, and the penalty factors associated can be tuned relative to what that e-tags priority once we implement these additional new market design features. And I realize we're discussing them in a couple different groups, but they are deeply intersecting to this group because it is that functionality on using the e-tags to identify the appropriate penalty prices to be applied so that let's say, intertie transaction that's submitted at an intertie point on the border of Idaho. If you don't mind, Kathy, I'll use you as an example since you're presenting. At the border where we set up an intertie point, which has an E-tag for long-term firm rights, would have the highest priority associated with the self-schedules and be respected and be cleared on available transmission capacity that is above and beyond what's made available as an EDAM transfer. And I do think we need to get creative and think of it as there's total transfer capability. Some of it has already been subscribed. And we're going to get transactions that need to get priority associated with that subscription. And then there's incremental amounts that are made available through EDAM. And I'm working on an example for this, but I did want to respond and say I think that we're still cross-talking a bit because I do think it's doable from a market implementation perspective.
Great, thanks.
George, would you like to respond?
Yes, I think this is a difficult concept here, so I'm going to let you down here, Kathleen. It's not possible, really. The concept of the tag is associated with the schedule, and we associate schedules with interties today. I know there are some scheduling constructs within BAAs, but our market mechanism and our model does not have the capability to recognize those. I don't even know what a tag means for a specific resource. We solve the network in a physical way. We don't direct the electrons to a specific intertie. Even if it's a self-schedule at the resource level, energy is injected into the grid, and it will be directed to the appropriate point to be consumed, either within the BAA or in another BAA across a network of transfers, and that's not traceable, that's not trackable. We don't solve internal schedules, we solve internal flows. So we don't really have a model as if it was, we're directing water on canals. These are electrons, and we solve it physically. So there is no really a mechanism that I know of, at least, and we don't have it in our model, that we can associate the energy of a resource with a specific transfer. So we don't have the ability to tag a resource to a specific transfer and say this resource is using this transfer. This resource is having a schedule, an optimal schedule injected on the grid, and then the transfer schedules are calculated basically from the power balance constraint in the BAA that says, okay, if you have more energy generated than the load, the surplus of energy is flowing on the network of transfers that you have, and that's why the transfer is not a resource-specific energy exchange. It's energy exchange between BAAs in general, so I will have to disappoint you on that. I'm sorry.
George, it's Dave Rubin. But the ISO does have the mechanism to sort of recognize ETCs and transmission ownership rights. I mean, to try and get to where I think Kathleen was heading, could you take some of that functionality and modify it so that you could get that recognition? I understand it may not be as easy as just sort of letting everybody, the generation bid as a price taker and optimize. Mm-hmm. But again, part of EDAM is to see where we can go, and we're going to have to modify our systems. The ISO may have to modify theirs. But, you do have that carve out and extra priority for the ETCs. Sure. Can something like that be leveraged to get closer to where I think Kathleen was trying to go?
Yes,
George
that's an account.
I just wanted to thank Dave for bringing.
Answer.
Yeah, I just wanted. Totally. Yeah. I just wanted to say that is exactly what I'm envisioning. So I appreciate your response, George, but wanted to thank Dave for highlighting that. Yeah.
So the concept of the high priority price taker schedules that we associate with scheduling constructs like ETCs and TORs, it's an accounting mechanism, really. So basically we say we have a load self-schedule here, we have a generation self-schedule here, they're equal in magnitude, and we tie them together. It's just a mechanism for accounting. That has nothing to do with the way we solve the market. The market is still solved, and there's high priority schedules. nothing is tying one to the other. If congestion cuts one schedule, the other it may not be cut. So it's just an accounting that happens ex post, saying, okay, we have this megawatts clear at this location and this megawatt consumed at this location, and there is a contract that ties those two. So then we have a settlement mechanism that maybe if it's a TOR, it's not subject to congestion between the source and the sink. And as far as the market is concerned, these are just high priority schedules in terms of injection, but they're not tied to each other. So it's just an accounting mechanism. If that is something that you're looking for, we can probably pull it off, because it's just accounting. It doesn't have anything to do with how we solve the market. Okay.
No, I really
George,
appreciate.
I do.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, Dave. I was just going to say.
I was just.
Oh, you go first, Dave.
Okay. We'll get it one way or another. I really appreciate that answer, and sort of the precision of it, and accounting here for us, and this gets into, I think, the point that Kathy was making, is really important. It's sort of who pays and how much, and because what we're trying to do as the EIM entity or EDAM entity transmission provider is to, let our customers continue to make the transactions that they have historically done at the prices that are, identified in our OAT, and at the same time hold the other customers harmless for congestion, so that there aren't uplifts that become problematic. So there may be things here in that functionality on an accounting side that are worth exploring. I'm sorry, Kathleen, I cut you off.
No, I super appreciate that and all of your thoughts. And this is something that I've been struggling with in my head for months. For those who don't know, we put forward a conceptual framework for how this to be done in the market back in July, I believe, that kind of gets into each of these, how you'd have the forward reservation process, how you would schedule them, how the market would respect it. And it's something that I can delve into more next week, or whenever I present. And we do think that there's a lot of benefits towards having the self-schedules, given the priority associated with the transmission that they have reserved. I did want to clarify one thing. I know I keep hearing George say transfers. For the piece that we're talking about, for the transmission that is not being made, because we're talking about third-party transmission that is not being made available to EDAM transfers. We're talking about the piece of the transfer that's already been reserved, that they have the scheduling rights for, and shouldn't be awarded to another resource, at least in this bucket that I think we're talking about. I think there's another bucket, which is the third bucket, what's unsold of available transfer capacity. And I think in that view, I see it similarly as not being transfers, not being a part of the transfer limit, but being an optimizing that transmission to award intertie transactions above and beyond what is made available kind of through that initial bucket one. And I think the penalty prices will become really important. And I a tiny quibble that my understanding is penalty factors do in fact give you earlier preference to clearing. And then if the market needs to cut transactions, that your lower penalty price gives you a lower curtailment priority. So I do think it does impact optimization. And it's something that we can design in a way that leverages the existing intertie functionality, leverages the EIM transfer, allows for co-optimizing everything simultaneously. And we do that in California in the real time, as I think most of y'all know. So we have the tools to do this, and I look forward to working on the details.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen. Let's go ahead and move on to bucket 2. Kathy, if you could take the
Sure.
slides back, that'd be great.
Yeah. Next, whoever's got in charge, next slide. All right, so bucket 2 is what we consider interchange rights holder transmission. So this is, again, transmission that has been procured by a transmission customer under an OAT. And so this, when we looked at this before, we were thinking it exists today in the EIM. A customer can do this with their firm transmission. So we were considering that, okay, a transmission, and I'll say firm under Idaho Power's OAT. I don't know what other providers' OATs say. So, but in Idaho Power's OAT, it's firm transmission. So it can be contributed on a voluntary basis by that transmission rights holder. So that transmission customer who owns that right. It should be, again, highly reliable. So again, currently require it to be firm. I'm not sure what the recent entities who have joined EIM, if this has changed for them. I'm not really sure what Bonneville ended up with and what Vista and others, but at least, again, for Idaho Power and some of the early entries into EIM, it was firm transmission. The thought is there's no incremental transmission charge, so no hurdle rate associated with this, but the right holder does receive the fair allocation of congestion rent that would occur, or that occurs, and they get that as their source of compensation. Next slide. Okay. I'll just say real quick on bucket 2. When we presented this back earlier, it didn't have the concept of what do you do with a customer that maybe doesn't want to donate this into the market. And I know in the principles document that the CAISO has put out, there is that outstanding question of could the market utilize that still and then somehow provide the customer, if they use it later, some kind of ability to do that. I do also want to point out that once bucket 2 is voluntarily donated to the market to use, the transmission customer can no longer use it for the period of time that they donated in. So if I'm a customer and I say, hey, market, I'm going to go ahead and give you this transmission to use because I'm not going to need it tomorrow. So here you go, optimize away, and I'm going to take whatever congestion comes from that as my payment. I then, if I get a deal that I actually need that transmission for, I can't take it back. So once voluntarily donated into the market for that time horizon, it is now not yours to take back. So I think that that's a big key to remember in this voluntary concept is it's only voluntary to put it in. It's not voluntary to take it back out once you've put it in for a time horizon. All right, and I think, Kathleen, you have a question on that one?
Kathleen, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Kathleen Colbert from District. Yeah, I do. I wanted to, and I think you need to go back one slide, whoever's running the slide, because we're on bucket 2, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I had a question, and I'd love to hear yours and Dave's and others' experience on this. So my understanding is that, like, in today's world, this is essentially made available through postbacks if the reservation that had previously been procured does not get scheduled in the day of early morning time frame. But I am fuzzy on the timelines and exactly how that works. Can you just kind of delve into that level of detail for a minute?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just speak on Idaho Power because each provider has a little bit different timelines in when they post back transmission that has been unscheduled. So for Idaho Power, if somebody has a firm reservation that has not been scheduled, we will release that as non-firm at I think it's noon PPT in our world. Some of them it's 10 o'clock, but that's kind of when it happens, and then it comes back as non-firm transmission to be utilized. That could be sold and utilized. And so that does occur today. So in the future, for instance, if this transmission customer said, yeah, I'm going to let EDAM use my firm transmission, right? Then in that case, from an ATC calculation, I would view that as already used and it wouldn't become a postback for non-firm usage because that transmission customer has given somebody else, in this case the market, the right to utilize that scheduling right. But it would be, you know, in a normal world without the market, it would be put back in as non-firm.
That's really helpful. I want to tease on something. So, because in my mind, when I've been thinking about the timeline, I've been thinking about as of, let's say, 8 a.m. the day prior, so T-1, any scheduling, any reservations that were not scheduled could be released to EDAM through the ATC by including them in as a postback for kind of firm daily, but released through the firm daily ATC submitted for EDAM purposes.
Yeah, so anything that is already sold on a firm basis is never posted back firm because that person never loses their right to use it firm. It's always non-firm, right? Because if you own a firm right that you're paying for, you could use it at any time that you want. But if you use it, that just means whoever else I sold it to on a non-firm basis might need to get off the path. And so it never posts back firm. It always posts back non-firm. So I think that that's a big clarification, which is why, you know, it's not going to be in the firm ATC unless, I mean, there's other ways it could be, but I mean, those are just, it's not because somebody didn't use it.
I think that's helpful. I think that, so let's say it's non-firm ATC that's calculated the day of in the morning. If it were not scheduled, it would be released for that purpose for EDAM as kind of a substitute for opening the daily reservation window.
If it's determined that non-firm ATC is utilized by EDAM, I think that that's a question, right?
I agree with the question. Yeah.
I think it determines, you know, it's based on what do we consider high quality for EDAM transfers. Because again, if this person did not voluntarily give it to the market, they retain the right to use it at all times. And then, you know, just what's the ramification for that? And I know Kaiso's given some thought to that, and maybe others have as well. But yeah, it doesn't go in as firm unless the person donates it.
Super helpful. And maybe the donate thing. So if they donate it, it does go back. It can go back as a postback and non-firm.
No, it won't, because now the market is considered to use it.
Okay.
Right. Now, if the market decides not to use it, if the market decides not to use it and basically says, oh, we're not going to use this, and gives it back to them at the end, if that's allowed, then of course it would fall into the ATC calculation until they use it. But for the period of time where they let the market have it, I mean, I think that that's a question as well, right? If the market doesn't utilize it in day ahead in the actual market run, does it go back to the person that donated it, or does the market have it all the way through real time? I don't know. That's a question, I think, you know, fundamental question to ask.
I think that is.
It doesn't necessarily go back to the ATC calculation unless we determine that the market gives that back to the transmission customer. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Hey, Kathy?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Dave.
Although Kathleen's sort of articulating this in a way that I haven't thought of, but I do think it's helpful, and that is, you know, and this gets into some of the discussions we had over the summers with the PTOs. I mean, clearly we're trying to come up with a way where the market can utilize unscheduled transmission, both network, you know, potentially import rights or exports. And I sort of like, Kathleen, where you're going, unless I'm misstating it, which is, you know, I had sort of viewed it as bucket one. We, you know, already sold it, but I think this discussion has really highlighted for me the way it works today is it would be treated as non-firm sold, and then obviously if we sell non-firm, it's sort of treated as a revenue credit for the customers. If we did the same here and the market is, you know, we get comfortable, that the market can redispatch so that the customer could utilize intraday any of their unscheduled transmission, but we can make it available. We could make it available as bucket 3, and then the revenues obviously from bucket 3 may minimize sort of that cost shift loss of our non-firm revenue that we otherwise might see in EDAM. So it may make it sort of a little bit easier for a transmission provider to enter the market.
Kevin, did you want to add something?
Actually, Dave, I like the way you're unpeeling this. I was actually going to go back to the point of the kind of in the instance where the bucket 2 is put into the market by the rights holder at that time. And again, I think there is a model for this, but it's more of a monthly model. But there is the concept of the exchange of option CRRs for that donation of transmission. And this came up, you know, it was originally an issue with PAC and then later with tank. So there is kind of this mechanism, and once that's donated, at this point it's a monthly type donation and it's lost to that individual user. They make a choice to utilize that. But I think when we start getting into the daily issues, obviously it raises a lot more challenges, but there is at least an incremental model that's already out there that kind of lays out this concept of a rights holder being able to put their transmission into the ISO in exchange for option CRRs.
Okay, Kathy, why don't we go ahead on to bucket 3.
Okay. Next slide. So then bucket 3 is that unsold transmission that the transmission service provider calculates and can then let the market know. Again, mechanics will matter on this one as well as far as timing and different things like that. But it's basically that unsold transmission that's made available. It hasn't already been purchased by a customer, and therefore, like it's not paid for yet by a third-party customer. Now, that doesn't mean the transmission service provider, you know, that just means it's native load, most likely is going to pay for it. But it's not used by another party. So not served. And George, I see you have a question on bucket 2, so hold on a sec. Because this bucket 3 transmission has not been compensated under somebody's OAT as a point-to-point transaction, the thought is it needs to incur an incremental charge for the transmission service provider to pay for that cost of service. And that's because there's a risk to the transmission provider and other customers that are paying for the embedded cost of the system of not being compensated under different transmission rate-making purposes if it's not charged. And so this may generally be unsold ATC, again, not unscheduled rights, the way we were thinking of it. And so that's kind of what we were thinking. And again, you know, we're trying to avoid any potential cost shifts. The thought again was, you know, transmission pricing is done under each of our OATs, and for Idaho Power, it's approved at FERC. So, you know, the rate that this gets charged, you know, if you want a simple option, every provider sets their own, and they go and get that approved at FERC. So that's just more details that will have to be determined. But there's basically, I think the simple concept is this requires some compensation above just congestion rent. So Deb, I'll leave it to you. I know George has a question on bucket 2, and then I see, you know, like Kevin has his hand up, maybe wanting to talk about bucket 3, I'm guessing.
Okay, let's go to George on bucket 2 first, and then Kevin. George?
Thank you, Deb and Kathy. This is George Angelidis. The question on bucket 2, if we could go back a slide, it's not necessary, but there was a statement that there is no hurdle rate, there is no cost for the bucket 2. It's essentially donated free to EDAM for everyone's use. And this concept is justified by the fact that there is already auto recovery for the cost of this transmission. And this is a similar concept with essentially the transmission that is released in EIM. There is, however, an issue that we'll run into and eventually discuss when it comes to the topic of external resource participation. We did run into this in our EIM design early on, and this was concerning the potential recovery cost for this transmission when it's used to wheel through a BAA. When that BAA is not really having a direct benefit of their own transmission if it's used by others to wheel through. And I wanted to ask Kathy and maybe others how they feel about that. I know at some earlier point, we even had contemplated a transmission rate for this bucket. We had some examples that were showing that. I know we are at this point now with no rate, but I wanted to see how everyone feels about that, because eventually we will run into this discussion when we start talking about external resource participation and whether we have import bids at the boundary of the EDAM market footprint. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll just start off and then I'll let anyone else that has a thought on this. Yeah, I mean, the starting position, again, when somebody was just voluntarily giving it in, it was like, well, you could give it in and, you know, there's no additional compensation to you. However, you know, I'm not opposed to paying a transmission customer if they wanted to put it in. I think that that's a concept that, you know, has to be thought of. Today, they have the option to resell this to somebody else. So there is a mechanism for a transmission customer to resell their transmission at an agreed to price to another customer. And that is a revenue potential stream for them. So the question is, you know, if somebody can resell that transmission to another transmission customer or give it to the EDAM for potential just only congestion rights, what are they going to do? So I think that that's, you know, I don't have a big maybe standing opinion on this. You know, I think what we were trying to kind of get a balance between, George, honestly, was every incremental cost of transmission that we put in this just creates more inefficiency in the market. So, you know, we were kind of not thinking about a cost on this one because, again, thinking it from pure transmission provider rate making philosophy. So I don't know if others have thoughts on that. Again, not opposed to it. I mean, it just creates some inefficiencies.
Kevin, did you have a comment that you wanted to chime in?
Actually, I do want to get to an issue in bucket 3, but I actually just left my hand up. I do want to talk, maybe Kathy, as you go through that. I don't know if it was in the slide when we discussed it, but just the issue of kind of how we view voluntary versus, you know, the line between what is going to happen versus voluntary with respect to bucket 3.
Yeah, we could get there. Did I see another hand up? Don't know.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead. Steve, is your question on bucket 2 or bucket 3?
It's kind of both. So.
Okay, then go ahead.
Two very quick clarify. Steve Greenwood, Brookfield. 2 quick clarifying questions. Number one, and Kathy, David, Kevin, just on the way the OAT works, a NITS customer, do they get load ratio share based allocations on intertie capacity, or is it, as far as intertie capacity goes, it's really only where they have a designated network resource? So just in general, you know, could a network customer get a load ratio share allocation across all interfaces, and how, you know, is that protected and or made available? And then the second question, and Kathy, thanks for touching on the resale provisions. And my question is, I just don't recall, what is I think there's a resale price cap. Yeah, anyway, if you could just clarify those points, that'd be great.
Kathy, do you want to try or do you want me to?
Go ahead. Thanks.
All right. Gosh, this is like old home week talking with Steve and Debbie on the same meeting.
We've been around way too long.
Fair enough, which is why none of this actually changes. Under the oath, at least for NV, as we implement it, a customer does not get a load ratio share. In order to reserve intertie capacity, the customer has to have a designated network resource external to our BA. Now, that external resource, a WSVP Schedule C agreement, for example, can be used to meet their whole load. It can't be more than their whole load, but that's why we end up having to reserve a significant amount of import capacity for a lot of our customers. But for example, NV Energy has no import capacity in our northern system because we have no DNRs outside and it's been fully subscribed by other customers. In terms of the resale, that was how FERC originally set it up when you wrote 888, but they modified it. I don't know if it was 890 or later on, but I think they lifted the cap on resale.
Okay. No resale price cap. Okay.
Right.
And just out of curiosity for you, David, or Kathy or Kevin, how transparent is that when customers resell? Is that posted someplace?
Correct. There's an OASIS posting of it. At least that's my recollection. It is not a frequently used service for us. I don't know, Kathy or Kevin, if it's different on your systems, but I do believe the amount and the price are transparent.
Yeah, they do a resale function on OASIS, and other customers can see it if they want the transmission service provider to bill for them, basically. I mean, there's this whole caveat of things, but that's where it should be done. And I don't know if the price is public, but I think it is as well. And I think there's a big thing to make sure that is maybe generally understood, and maybe it is. There's a difference between a network customer and how much of the cost of the system they're allocated, as opposed to how much of the scheduling rights they have on interties. So, for instance, in Idaho Power, the network customers pay their load ratio share of the transmission investment of the system, but they maybe don't have any intertie capacity to come into Idaho Power because that's based on designated network resources and load need. So I think there's a big, just because a customer's paying a load ratio share of the entire transmission system investment doesn't necessarily mean they have specific rights of imports.
Okay, so I mean, that sounds like it's consistent between NV and Idaho. It's really predicated on designation of network resources and the capability to import. Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah, and thanks for the clarification on the resale. I would say, my presumption coming in is, at least from a bucket 2 perspective, I understand it's a balancing act, but I was presuming that you may want to consider compensation above and beyond congestion rents just from an incentive in making transmission available. But I also appreciate, Kathy, your point on kind of overall efficiency and not wanting to, well, it wouldn't be pancaking, but it would be, increasing transmission costs, for the system as a whole. So anyway, thanks for those clarifications.
Steve, this is Kevin. I actually think that, we talked about congestion rent allocation as a mechanism, but I don't think we went really beyond that. I think the issue is market liquidity. And, you know, I think over time you will see or not see, you know, whether there's sufficient incentive. I mean, there's some significant bucket 2 transmission that interconnects California and the Northwest and other regions, right? So, you know, we have to have some way to ensure or at least incentivize participation by third-party transmission rights holders. And so I think that that's an interesting and probably an important conversation. I think the starting point is clean, simple, as Kathy articulated, and we never really got beyond that. But I do think that that is an interesting question that probably needs to get vetted. And that's why I say I think bucket 2 is probably the biggest challenge among the 3 buckets.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I mean, I would agree. And my understanding from the earlier working group meeting was that it was an issue on the table. So I'm glad for that. And, you know, when we get into even the nuances of allocation of congestion rents, and obviously CRRs, I mean, you mentioned earlier just the whole concept of option CRRs, which, you know, is distinguishable and I think important, just the nuances of how you allocate those congestion rents and the types of congestion rents need to be discussed further as well. So thanks for that.
Right.
Absolutely.
And Doug, to your question as to whether point-to-point customers are compensated for their unused rights that are posted back beyond receiving a share of non-firm revenues as credits, the answer is no. So if you don't use your transmission rights and then the transmission service provider sells that as non-firm, there's no direct compensation back to you for that specific transmission. And then it's dealt with in however the transmission provider's FERC approved rate is. Okay, so I think we talked about, sorry, go ahead.
Jeff Nelson just had a comment.
Oh, okay. Jeff?
Okay, sorry, I couldn't unmute. I didn't know if the host needed to do it. Hey, good morning, everyone. I guess my real comment was on bucket 3. This is the unsold transmission. And some of the discussions we had, basically, that's sort of on some flavor of cost-based pricing and some sort of FERC approved. But that's an up to pricing in the FERC construct that people can charge up to the OAT rate, the transmission providers. And then we talked about once it gets resold, there's that sort of goes away. It's my understanding of the mechanics. So what we talked about in the group was for bucket 3 transmission, the transmission provider could have up to pricing, and they could actually provide it to the market at something less than what their sort of posted OAT rate was. And again, in the spirit of trying to increase liquidity, and there would still be congestion rents that would flow through to it. So just a comment there. On bucket 2, you know, that transmission's already being compensated. It's already been bought, and it's my position, and that the principles that we came up with were that bucket 2 transmission wouldn't be allowed to have some flavor of hurdle rate attached to it. It had already been paid for, and now it would be put into the market as part of the optimization. So that was my understanding of the principles document.
And you are correct. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's correct. Yeah, transmission provider, you know, can discount a path if they want, and you know, you could offer it to the market at a discounted path as well. There's some rules around that, of course, of fair and equitable treatment to other customers, but that could be done. All right, next slide. This is, again, the compensation slide that we've kind of talked to. You know, the reason for the concept of compensating the transmission service provider, again, there's the potential for a larger volume of transactions in the day ahead than there is necessarily in the EIM. The unsold ATC, that's not already acquired or paid for by a transmission customer is used, and trying to, again, minimize that cost shift to the customers that are paying the embedded cost of the transmission system. There's just some options for potential transmission approaches. Again, you could just do everyone's individual entity rates and the CAISO's wheeling charge, wheeling access charge if you wanted to do that. You could look at a blended rate if everyone kind of agreed to that. You could look at a nominal rate if, again, everyone did that. And again, this is where that potential discounted off-cost based approach comes from that Jeff mentioned, that the transmission provider does have that right to be able to do that. Or you could have a volumetric uplift charge based on power flows. So there's various different ways to look at this compensation, but at the end of the day, I think the concept is there needs to be a compensation that the transmission service providers agree to for this particular bucket, and they've got to be able to get it past all of their customers as well, and of course it will have to be potentially dealt with at FERC. So, Jeff, I don't know if you still have your hand up from before or if you have another question, comment.
Sorry, it was up from before, but thank you for getting to these options. I appreciate it.
Okay, yeah. So this is just, again, these are not, like, we have not given great thought depth into this. This is just, as we were talking about it 2-3 years ago, however long ago it was, these are just things that we threw out within that group, so.
But what you are looking for is to have consistency across the various EDAM entities.
Well, I think it would be really, I don't know if there's a couple entities that just wanted to do a blended rate. I don't know. I do think you have to have agreement from every transmission service provider on how they want their compensation. And if one entity says it's my OAT rate and that's all it is, and, Nevada says, well, we'll take $3, they can view that as, a discounted rate to their system if they want. But I don't know that everyone has to agree on it's $3 unless, $3 is below their OAT rate. And I think that there has to be some consensus on how this is done. But I think there's maybe some ways, and Dave maybe can think of others that you could, apply a little differently. But at the end of the day, the transmission service provider has to agree to whatever that rate is, or it's going to be their OAT rate most likely.
Right. Okay, great.
And I know we're going to have, many further discussions about what a rate could be. I guess what I would just try and tee up here, as we went through these different options, the more you blend, the more, for example, you could put a blended rate in the ISO tariff, but it raises all sorts of questions as to how it's calculated, how it's allocated. In terms of just getting a market stood up, the simplest and most direct mechanism in our mind was each EIM entity has an approved rate. For NV Energy, we have Schedule 8. It's our non-firm hourly rate, but at least it gets us to the point where we have a value that we could use in the market that's approved by the commission. All of these other things, I sort of harken back to the transmission access charge negotiations and settlements and litigation at FERC. It can get really complicated really fast, and no market is going to be static. But if we could do something a little simpler to get it established, that would be, I think, serve all of us well. And the other, I think it was in one of the prior calls, I think we talked about maybe using a market-based rate. That sort of scared some of us on the FERC compliance side because, again, our transmission group has a long history of making ATC available at approved prices. We didn't want to get into a position in a market where it looks like the transmission group, through the pricing of transmission, would be favoring generation of our own. And that's really something that sort of concerned us. So again, just sort of keeping with some of the basic transmission principles and trying to take sort of the most direct and simplistic approach, at least, to see how things work. That's where I think some of the push towards individual utility approved rates went to.
And Dave, I think that, this is Kevin, I think that provides the flexibility as well, because of course you have a rate, a posted rate, but it doesn't limit the transmission service provider from providing a rate discount on that rate. And so it gives them kind of as Jeff said, a boundary, an upper boundary, but it gives them the flexibility to kind of gauge, some compensation's better than no compensation. And so anyway, I think that's kind of where we ended up, because the hurdle rate also becomes, a volumetric becomes a real challenge with allocations and other things as well.
Okay, let's go on and finish the bucket 3 slides before we take additional questions.
Okay, next slide. Again, determining the bucket 3 rates, like we've kind of talked about, you're balancing the need to meet the revenue requirements with the desire to have a charge that does not prevent economic optimization. Some thoughts is, whether how to depancake, whether and how to develop cost-based rates, the complexity of the regulatory and governance of stakeholder context. So basically, I think Dave kind of addressed this really well, that the simplistic way to actually get this moving is just to use the FERC-approved out rates that are already in the tariffs. Those have been vetted by FERC and the stakeholders of the transmission customers. If you start to do beyond that, it could create some significant delays and potential regulatory risks that, quite honestly, some transmission service providers are not willing to take. So that's kind of just the thoughts that go into that. It's a definite balance. Next slide. Oh, okay, go back, because this is now kind of just getting into that concept of optimization. So Deb, if you want to start the questions.
Yep. Kathleen?
Great. No, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vista. Thanks so much. I had a couple of things, and unfortunately, I did actually want to ask a question. I'd like to pose a question for the group, open to anyone's input. I think it may resonate more with the EDAM folks, but on bucket 2, sorry, I had my hand up for a while. So back on bucket 2, I think that as we talked through, there's kind of 3 subcategories of bucket 2, right? There's rights not released that we need to make sure are respected, which we talked about in the bucket 1 too. So I think we can keep that more general. There's rights donated or resold. How do we do that? And rights not scheduled, potentially getting released through non-firm ATC or some other approach, open discussion questions. But what I wanted to highlight on the rights donated or resold is I had a question, which is that I know that there are existing processes to do this, but I was wondering if one of the maybe potential benefits that EDAM could bring is that, should we talk about a secondary market set up by the CAISO, by EDAM, for the purpose of transmission customers who own those rights to submit offers to release them, and then have some kind of mechanism for the CAISO to clear that type of market, or is the preference of the EDAM entities to keep it on your own? Maybe you think about another process, because I heard someone mention the monthly, and I've been thinking about the timing of it, and had thought maybe some kind of additional post-back process is what I've been calling it, but additional donation process in the T-2 timeframe for transmission customers who own the rights to identify they're willing to resell or donate them going into the next day is something we need to talk about how we do that. And I was wondering if you could think about, do you prefer to do that on your own, or do you think that's something that the EDAM market paradigm should contemplate? I just kind of want to stop there and say that's one of the big questions I've been struggling with and wanted to pose to the group.
Yeah, because I hadn't really thought about it, quite honestly. I don't want to be in the middle of somebody that wants to make their transmission available to the market. I think there needs to be a mechanism for them to let the market know that themselves. But I also don't want to create a situation where this transmission is considered a resale under my tariff, and now I have EQR reporting obligations and potential billing obligations and every other obligation that comes along with a resale that occurs. So I guess I'm open to whatever. My preference is that the customer themselves lets CAISO know, and I'm not in the middle of that as a transmission service provider, and that it doesn't put some kind of billing or compliance obligation of reporting on me. I think that's kind of the most thought I've put into it.
Kathleen, this is Kevin. I think that's a good question. Again, maybe going down a layer beyond where we went, but I think just simplistically, I think we look at it as a third party. I look at it as a third party customer has those rights, and that would be something that they would conduct directly and make that decision. But then you get into another layer of mechanics, and I think that's kind of where you're going as well. But I agree with Kathy on just kind of the concept.
Yeah, let's go ahead and we'll talk about that more in the detail as we get into the weeds. So Steve Keene, you have your hand raised.
Steve, you can go ahead. Your line is unmuted. Steve, you may be double muted. Your line is unmuted, and you may go ahead.
Okay, we'll come back to Steve. Jeff Spires.
Good morning. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. Kathy, thanks to you and to Kevin for going through these materials. I think it's really helpful just to kind of start from at least how a lot of the EIM entities had been thinking through what these buckets were intended to represent back during the initial workshops pre-COVID. Just kind of a comment to tee up a question that might be directed mostly to George, but I think also just for group discussion. Related to bucket 1 and 2, both of those categories are based on a fundamental premise around voluntarily contributing transmission that's owned by an OAT rights holder of some kind, as opposed to bucket 3 being, as we were just talking about, unsold inventory that's coming directly from the TSP. And another sort of assumption around this concept was that the OAT scheduling and the OAT framework is continuing to exist alongside of the EDAM. The bilateral markets continue to exist. So there's these other things going on. And I'm trying to reconcile those assumptions with a few of the issues that George has raised both this morning and last time. My understanding from George, what you had said last meeting was that transmission within a BA has to be made available to the market. There's no capability to carve out internal OAT rights within a particular BA. And then earlier this morning, in the context of the bucket 1 discussion, it sounded like what you were saying is that all transmission associated with bucket 1 is optimized, even transfers between BAs, because there's no ability to associate a specific resource with the OAT rights that they may be using to deliver that resource, and there's no ability to see E-tags, et cetera. And so if those are true, I'm just struggling to understand, how does the OAT framework function in that paradigm? And maybe more specifically, what I'm trying to better understand is, how does an OAT rights holder that is wanting to physically schedule their resource on their own transmission reservations outside of the market continue to do that. And furthermore, if they are doing that, how is their OAT priority honored in terms of determining who flows over a constrained path? Because I'm just having a hard time sort of understanding how that framework works if there isn't a mechanism through the market to see those reservations, to evaluate their priority and honor them. So if, I think that's a question for George, but also I think it's more fundamentally just something that we should collectively be understanding before we go too far.
Hi, Jeff. This is George Angelidis. You're right. Once transmission is made available to the market's going to use it in the most efficient way. So because there's no specific association of a transmission path with a resource, that's why I'm saying from a market perspective, you don't have a mechanism to say this transmission or this specific transfer is reserved for this customer. There is no such a thing. However, as I mentioned earlier as a response to David, this is really an accounting process that can happen. And from an accounting standpoint, you can have a self-schedule, which we can talk about the possibility of having high priority self-schedules, the way we have them associated with scheduling constructs in the ISO market, where you can have a self-schedule that, under most circumstances will become a final schedule in the market on one side, and a similar situation for a sync on the other side. It could be on a different BAA. And from an accounting standpoint, so you can say that these pair of self-schedules, they're using this specific transfer as a scheduling construct. But from the market perspective, there is no such an association. So if the accounting process, the way I describe it here, fulfills the notion of having specific transmission release and used by a specific customer, then that's fine. We can have that. But in the notion where the market will optimize resources, but will retain the use of a specific transfer for a specific customer, we don't have that. And actually, you don't want that. Even if we were able to put a constraint to have that, that will segregate the market with impact on the LMPs. The LMPs for this customer will be different than the LMPs of other resources in the same location of the grid, because there will be a specific constraint that will separate their prices. So I don't think you want this kind of market segregation. If it's an accounting issue, we can resolve it. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Just to quickly respond to that.
Jeff, hold on. George, we currently have the transmission ownership rights and the existing contract rights functionality. We've had that since 1998 when we started up. So that the entities that do have transmission contracts, they're held harmless. You call it a settlement functionality versus a market functionality. But the bottom line is that the entity that has the existing contract or the transmission ownership rights is held harmless if load is served by the resource that it has, and they're not charged for transmission. That's correct, right?
Yes, Debbie, this is correct for internal transmission to ABA, and extending this concept over transfers will inevitably interfere with, and I don't say interfere in a bad way, but I'm saying it will impact the way we calculate and allocate transfer revenue, obviously. Because if you're going to carve out this portion of a transfer revenue and a transfer that's associated with a scheduling path with a specific customer, then you have to take it into consideration in how you calculate the transfer revenue, how you allocate it, because you have to carve out that piece and basically, in a similar manner what you described, hold that customer immune to transfer cost. So again, all of this, in my view, is accounting, and we can do it in an accounting setup. with the proper information to track it and validate it and do it in settlements. But it's not for the market functionality. The market sees this transfer as available for everyone to use in the most efficient way.
George, just to briefly respond to that, I'm really struggling with the characterization of this as being an accounting issue. I think determining who physically flows and what the priorities are during critical conditions is an important question that is not an accounting question. It's about who flows when it matters. And I think, obviously we had a very contentious debate about that in the context of the wheel through initiative. And I think the question of how are outrights respected through the market optimization from a physical perspective is a critical issue, and it's more than an accounting exercise.
Oh, okay. I see, Jeff. I'm saying if we can solve this with the accounting process that we essentially use today for existing transmission cuts and transmission ownership rights, and it works for these rights holders today, then wouldn't that be sufficient? I mean, I don't think we have the actual way to enforce in a market solution a specific physical flow of electricity. I mean, you know that. So if the issue that you're bringing up, we can resolve it through accounting, and maybe you don't like the characterization accounting. I don't know how else to call it. It's not a market mechanism. The market mechanism is reduced to just having high schedule priority for certain resources that are associated with information that says, okay, they're paired, they have a contract, blah, blah. But as far as the market goes, we just optimize the entire grid based on bids, right? So if the accounting, you may not like the word, serves the purpose of what you want to accomplish, what's the problem?
Milos, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, thank you. This is Milos with the California. So, and I think, Jeff, you bring a valuable point to the discussion. I think that's where this discussion will need to go next is, and I think Kathy covered it a little bit, what's the quality of the transmission that's made available in the bucket? What's the level of firmness? Is it firm, conditional firm? And then there's this other concept of otherwise highly reliable, which plays into that if there are certain actions that need to be taken on transmission, what's the priority of that transmission? But there's also the topic of confidence in EDAM transfers that I think Kathy also addressed, and we'll have to address it. Part of it, I think, is being addressed in the RSC working group, where we'll go through a number of different scenarios and, what is the confidence in EDAM transfers that we want under those different scenarios, and that gets into the priorities discussion as well of EDAM transfer. So it's a fair point that you raised that we'll need to consider in these discussions, whether it's, how we account for it. I think we're trying to address it with the type of transmission that's made available, and then this discussion on confidence in EDAM transfers and how do we implement that. I think that will be part of those discussions. What's the best way to reflect that in the market, those priorities and that confidence. So hopefully that addresses your question. I think George is getting at, there's different ways of accounting for this, but I think that discussion yet is pending still on the confidence in the transfers and ultimately how do you implement that and account for it in the market.
Okay, thanks, Milos. Steve Keen, are you available? Can we hear you? It might be your headset. It looks like you're using a headset. Are you double muted? Okay.
Yeah. Steve, you may need to disconnect from WebEx and dial back in since we cannot hear your audio. So you might want to consider doing that because you are unmuted.
Okay. Let's move on to Callie Wells.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. I just had two questions. The first one's more of a clarifying question, and then the second one is one I wanted to kind of tee up as it relates to bucket 3. So my clarifying question is, when we're talking about donating the transmission to the market or making it available to the market, I heard, it's a daily decision. So is the idea that when they make that decision, the transmission is available for all 24 hours within the day? Or is there a scenario where you might potentially make the transmission available, but it's only available for certain hours of the day?
No, the transmission would be available for all 24 hours.
Okay, that was what I assumed, but I just wanted to make sure that was the case.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And then on bucket 3, I was curious if there's been any thought to, if they have these, let's just say if they go with the individual OAT rates, is there any discussion around how frequently they might change the hurdle rate? So it sounds like each OAT has kind of an up to rate, and there's this discussion about, well, maybe they can make it available at a lower rate. Is it the envision that they could change it on a day-to-day basis, or once they lock it in, is it locked in for a year, hypothetically?
We haven't gotten into those details yet. That will be a subsequent discussion.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, VJ.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this very helpful presentation. And I remember the revival of these slides from 2 years ago. If you move to the next slide on bucket 3, WR is not a transmission owner or operator, so our knowledge is much on the lower end than many of you. But I was listening to this Kathy's presentation and thoughts on the open-mindedness on what compensation approach could be used here. I posed a question and a comment. The question being, I personally do not know that how much liquidity exists in bucket 3 transmission after bucket 1 and 2. So if Jeff and Kathy and others who are transmission experts out there, and the market operators and merchant business owners, if you envision a funnel where bucket 3 is the funnel at the bottom, and it's the least available, but it's least available, but with least restrictions as well. My only comment / request would be to please keep a guiding principle of practicality and transparency to make it liquid enough to be usable, so you're not bogged down in transaction costs and you're not counting pennies to make pound savings look good. So a basic fundamental rule of policy economics I wish to share, not that you all don't know, but I think you have enough complexities between the OAT and firm, non-firm, and flow-based intentions in bucket 1 and 2 that I hope in bucket 3 you will try to keep things as simple as possible. Unless you feel otherwise, I would be happy to learn. So it's really a sort of a rhetorical question, but it's more of a comment as well. Thank you.
Anybody want to jump in on that?
I think as far as inventory, right? I mean, that really is very much transmission service provider dependent. So that one's kind of hard to answer, and that is, transparent because it's on everyone's OASIS sites as far as what that is, and how much that inventory changes is really beyond our control, in the fact that it has to be available for sale. So I don't know if Dave or Kevin has other thoughts, but I appreciate the comment. And we can certainly continue to have that conversation about that.
Well, maybe this touches, I may be misunderstanding a question, BJ, so forgive me, but this is Kevin. But I think this is part of the issue of voluntary when it relates to bucket 3, and the idea being, at least in our thinking, I'd say our, meaning some of us, there may be others who have different opinions on this, but that the ATC that exists at a certain time of the day, and as we move, and I think Kathy's going to talk about timelines as well, at least what we contemplate at one point, that transmission is going to be made available to the market for optimization. And so there's not kind of an idea that, we kind of make these transitory decisions. leaving aside pricing as to what, we haven't really come up with when are those decisions being made? Are they monthly, annual, so forth? But I think that there is this idea going to liquidity that, the market entities, most of the out holders don't want to have to make those types of decisions on a daily basis. So there's going to be kind of this automation aspect. So voluntary doesn't really mean voluntary. So I think from the ATC piece, there should be, what's available will be put into the market, except that which is obviously.
Okay. Moving on, Kathleen.
Great, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I want to just echo and thank Jeff for framing his question and content the way he did. I know we talked about, I attempted to bring it up in the beginning of the meeting, but I think the way that Jeff framed it was really, really useful, and appreciated George's additional feedback. I did want to say I'm a little concerned that there may not be broad awareness that we're talking about changing the way that we treat self-schedules to better respect OAT rights and better respect all, a more durable long-term design to impact the CAISO BAA that would impact on the day-ahead process. So when, we come to these types of conversations about EDAM, I assume that all of the CAISO, that it's level set what we're already considering changing in the day-ahead market without an extension. So since we're talking, like, all of the concepts I've been bringing up of the day-ahead scheduling, you have new penalty prices in there for self-schedules based on whether they've been associated with a tag or not, that has different priorities. That is being discussed for current footprint. So I wanted to make sure that was clear. We need to struggle with it, and that across the board. And this is just another venue because they're related projects that it keeps getting brought up as a need to address. One of our principles is what we've always thought of the transmission market and service priority that's doing these things, and that we need to design new solutions to do so in the day ahead would be extended to the other areas and allow for, again, these OAT rates to be respected as Jeff described. And I'm hearing a little of, we can't do that, when I know it's being discussed in multiple venues at CAISO. I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that what we're raising is consistent with what we understand to be changing across the board as a solution to address the controversy that Jeff alluded to for the real true priorities. And so I think we need to be, it's unfortunate it's been a chicken and egg because that working group's not done and it's in parallel, but they are very intertwined. And I think maybe I just asked the CAISO to make sure that George is level set on that project if he's not already up to speed on the existing proposals. I know we have one, again, I'll tease, submitted in July, it's in the comments. And if you could make sure to get everyone up to speed on that, that'd be super helpful before the next meeting, I think, and think about how we might better coordinate. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Ellen Meck, and then we'll go on because we're running out of time.
All right, this is Alan Meck. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Alan Meck from San Diego Gas and Electric. I just wanted to touch on or expand on something that Kevin brought up that I thought was really interesting. So if we are going to have a commitment for, a month ahead or even a year ahead, would we allow people to switch resources between bucket 1, bucket 2, and bucket 3? Would we allow them to switch that daily, intra-hour, or is it just going to be set? You designate this resource in this bucket and that's the way it is for the duration of however long. I don't know. That's a question I've been trying to wrestle with, and I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts.
I don't see anyone jumping in. So this is Kathy. I guess I'll go out on a limb here. In my view, this is a day ahead market. And when you start expanding beyond that, right, you're starting to get into a situation where, you're asking people to maybe change more than they're willing to for a day ahead market. So what I mean by that is if you say, hey, there's this transmission a month out that's daily transmission, 30 days from now, you can't do anything with that. That's going to be a problem under my OAT because it can be sold, right? And so bucket 3 can change at any time until I offer it into the market and allow the market to determine if it's going to utilize it and quote unquote reserve that transmission. So, and the same thing goes with, RS transmission. We can do a showing 45 days in advance and tell you what the plan is, but that's non-binding. The plan's going to change, and I promise you that by the time it comes to tomorrow, when I'm getting ready to set up for tomorrow, there's going to be resources that I maybe have undesignated and sold somewhere else because I didn't need them. There's going to be, other things. So I think I understand entities wanting to get some security of this stuff farther out, but I think at the end of the day, you have to remember that every BA is entering this is retaining their own responsibilities from a balancing authority perspective, and to not get mixed up with information that CAISO entities maybe are giving CAISO because of their balancing authority role as opposed to their market role. I think there's going to be quite honestly, it's going to be an interesting conversation to continue and talk about, but there's going to have to be a balance with how far out people are willing to commit and hold those decisions to participate. So that's not a great, well thought out answer, but that's kind of the answer.
But Kathy, I think what you just raised is correct because, as you said, think the system changes. There's all kinds of things that are going to change leading up to the day ahead, including what ATC is on my system. And so, there will be a time, let's just say 9 or 8, whatever it is, and that ATC is going to go to the market. And that will vary on a daily basis because there will only be, summer is going to be very different for some and so forth. So it's kind of a hard one to get to, but I think that's kind of the general concept is that those 2 buckets are going to be fairly transitory, except that we're going to have certain mechanisms that say that by a certain time that, here's where we are.
And George, did you have a comment along those lines?
Oh, Debbie, yeah, thanks. There was an earlier question. That's why I raised my hand. I might as well clarify something here. I think I heard that there was a question on how frequently and how often resources are associated with those transmission products. And I just wanted to clarify once again that there is no association of resources to a transfer unless we're talking about the specific resources that we use to model the transfers, which we called ETSRs. But regular resources that participate in the market, they're not associated with a transfer. The transfer is a BA to BA energy exchange. Now, the only exception is along the lines that we were talking earlier about having possibly transmission ownership right or the like of these contracts that span interties, and you want to have a mechanism where you have either physical or financial rights represented in the market solution, again, as an accounting mechanism in the market solution, so that you have a resource associated with a transfer, let's say a physical right, so there is a high priority injection, and then a specific transfer which is carved out for that resource, and then a sink on the other side that can clear the NIFM. And if it's a physical right, that's a high scheduling priority on both sides. You can, from an accounting standpoint, say that the energy is using that particular transfer, or from a financial right perspective, you can collect a transmission revenue on that transfer and give it back to that customer and things like. We can talk about that. These are accounting mechanisms, but this is the only exception if we want to go down that route. Generally, there's no association of a resource to a bucket transmission. Thank you.
Okay. Steve, real quick question. Greenleaf?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. I'm not exactly even sure how to articulate this, but just thinking through. I mean, let me preface this as a potential bucket 2 transmission holder, certainly interested in the ability to offer that transmission on a day-to-day basis. But it kind of brought me back to with these kind of, let's just say, physical contract path, based, whatever, transmission rights toggling in, being offered in or toggled in and out of the market on a day-to-day basis. Just the implications for congestion rights and how you even, a CRRN and even think about how to bid on that with fluctuations in the transmission capacity. And I was just, George, obviously very briefly, but just whether that kind of fluidity or variation on a day-to-day basis would almost lead the CAISO to want to move to that extended full network model-based system with, potentially 2 scheduling points just to kind of get a handle on it, but also make some more or try to stabilize it somewhat. I don't know if that makes sense, but I guess one basic question is, has anyone done kind of an assessment of the volume of bucket 2 transmission out there? I'm just trying to appreciate or try to get a better understanding of kind of the magnitude of the issue. Did any of that make sense?
Yeah. We've actually run out of time. Kathy, or I've already lost Dave. Kathy, any quick comment, or we can take it up on Thursday with the discussion on optimizing the transmission types?
Yeah, if we could hold it for Thursday. I have not looked at it, to be honest. I mean, I know how much bucket 2 transmission is on my system because I know how much I've sold, but whether or not customers would be willing to put that in, I have no idea.
Right. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. We have run out of time for today. We'll go ahead and pick up on Thursday. I'll ping some of the EIM entities and find out if they have an idea as to the sizing of bucket 2. And then we'll continue on with the presentation, moving to the optimizing each transmission type. So again, thank you, everyone. If you have any questions or would like to give a presentation, please go ahead, and the slide deck from last week gives you the links for the to submit a request for presentation. And with that, we'll go ahead and close the meeting. Everybody have a great day, and talk to you on Thursday.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.